intentionally, as I know there have been many celebrations already and there will be many more in the years to come. Dave was, as many people have said, a giant, a larger-than-life personality, and a man who filled the space with spirit, passion, and opinion. We will honor him today and every day when we pick up a book, cook for a friend, or defend an underdog. When I saw the weather forecast for today, I thought of David's time in the military. He hated the freezing cold of Alaska. He hated marching, and he says he hated singing. He would appreciate that you made this journey to be here today to celebrate his life in this sub-zero weather. Several people are going to speak or read in celebration of David, but there's also an opportunity for others to share memories. I would ask that when you volunteer, that you come up. I can hand you a microphone. You don't need to walk up on stage, but that you use the microphone so we can all hear what you have to say. I'm going to start because, well, I'm up here, and after days of writing pages and pages of memories, I finally winnowed them down to a few. David would have appreciated my editing process. So, David Calicchio. The first words Dave ever said to me before any form of introduction or greeting were, "What are you reading?" I was sitting on the second floor of the administration building at Putney School with a book in my lap, waiting for an interview with Barbara Barnes. It was August 1986, and I told the man standing in front of me, "The Moon Penance" by Thomas Williams. He nodded, asking curtly, "What else have you read?" I told him I'd just finished Cider House Rules. He nodded again and turned away, leaving me there without a clue as to who he was. An hour later, I was formally introduced to David Calicchio, head of the English department. I had an interview with him. Years later, David told me that he decided to fight for my hire from the moment I answered his questions about books. Once Dave was on my side, I was hired. To say Dave was a loyal friend, an invaluable mentor, is an understatement. He supported me through my years teaching at Putney with his usual pugnacious style. He always had my back. And after sharing an office with him for 11 years, I can say I was privileged to know many sides of David Calicchio. I saw the man whose students in his classes adored, but whom students who hadn't had him in the classroom feared. Dave cultivated a gruff, aloof persona, which belied the gentleman he was. I saw the man who wrote kind comments on the rather weak paper of a student who was struggling, but the man who wrote BS in red pen all over the introduction of a paper, written by a confident, capable student who was lazy. I saw the man who got really mad at a student who had been dishonest, but also the man who was fully supportive of the kid who had made a mistake, even an egregious one, and come clean. David was fiercely protective of his students, his friends, and his colleagues, those of us lucky enough to be close to him. He was dismissive of those he felt undervalued him or us, his posse, because we were a posse. The English department David built at Putney School was a team that worked together, supported each other, enjoyed time together, and laughed together. Pasta dinners at Nancy and David's house were the pinnacle of our enjoyment, and we all coveted invitations to eat the incredible meals Dave cooked for us. Every morsel was delicious, but David's praise for his cooking was always a dry, not bad. We knew otherwise. David loved his family and literature, sports and theater, friends, and his 4th of July parties under the apple trees on his lawn. He loved the North End, the Patriots, the Red Sox. He picked up his mail at the post office, drove to the co-op for a bagel with lox, and enjoyed the New York Times daily. The New York Times on the co-ops tab. He loved making toasts before starting a meal, and he loved a big hug as we departed the warm, welcoming atmosphere of his home. We will all miss Dave tremendously. But every time someone uses whom incorrectly, I will think of David. His smile and my embarrassment as he corrected me with a twinkle in his eye. Oh, Lori, who is the subject pronoun and whom is an object pronoun? David Calicchio was always a teacher. We're going to ask people who want to speak or say something to come up. If you want to just raise your hand. If people aren't quite ready for that, we have Nancy's niece and nephew who are here and will share. There we go.
I'm John in Virginia.
John and Virginia.
Yeah,
there you go.
Oh, you can hold it?
You can hold it or put it here.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah.
I was going to introduce myself as Nancy's older sister, Mary Ann, but in fact, I'm Mary Ann's daughter. This is my brother John, and we are here representing the Holmes side of the family. Hardly. So, my mom and dad were not able to make it. They're in Texas, where it's relatively warmer. And for our whole lives, the great north, the tundra that is Vermont, and Nancy and David have been larger than life. And we did not get to spend as much of time with them as we could have, but we are family, and we are here, and we are here supporting everyone. And I just want to say thank you, and I'm so excited just to see all the friends that David has. It's wonderful. So.
Okay. Nancy, Mom really wanted to be here. And you know, yesterday, or day before yesterday, when she had the flights and everything ready to go, what did we have? 2 or 3, yes, we're going, no, we're not going, yes, we're going, no, we're not. So they really, at one point, we were very concerned about the weather and the wind and the ice. And I think to say how much Mom wanted to be there was that she could just sit down on the snow and push herself back up to the door to get there. So so that she's not here and that we're here is really something we wanted to say that they really did want. Now, for me, I look around and I see so many people that I don't know. And so the David that I remember is the David that we would see every year coming up to Long Island for a vacation. So when I was, as long as I can remember, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and I think there was a picture of me running away, but running away from the grass. And my memory David was somebody who was big and rough like a bear, right? And then I come here, and as a child, that's how I remember. And now I come, and there's someone that could cook fabulous. Now I come and I see the stories that I heard last night, and looking around, and all of you, and it's the other side of David. And so I'm here now going to turn over and let you all speak, because I really want to continue to hear about the David through the eyes of an adult. So thank you.
Thank you.
So is there someone who would like to come up and share some memories? Please.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Cole. In the fall of '83, I came here for 2 years to Putney School and taught English. And I was just talking to my good friend Jennifer, who I live in San Francisco. And we were just commenting on how important it is when you find a mentor and someone who believes in you when you're a young person. And David was that person for me. I had a BA in English from Middlebury. Fall of '82, I took a course in Victorian Lit, worked at the library. Winter of '83, I was up in the Northeast Kingdom building canoes. And then I showed up in the fall of September to teach. Not really a safe bet, but there I was. And I was assigned to teach senior English. And I was 22, there was a 20-year-old dyslexic student in my class. And David took me under his wing. And it meant a great deal to me. And the pictures of food are very, very powerful. David was a man of literature and words, and I'm one of those people too. And so I want to read a couple things to you that I thought about when I heard the news. I'm not big on Facebook. I spend a lot of time online for my work, so I try to avoid it. But I did find the Mimeo sheets that David handed out when we first arrived, which were vocab sheets and sort of guidance and guidelines for young teachers. And there's one that he gave to me on the first week I was here. And this was a review of the English program at Putney, and it read, "Avoiding the argument that expository prose can and should be as imaginative and creative as fiction, poetry, and drama. Let's keep these categories and try to evaluate what we think we are doing in 4 years at Putney. What we actually are doing. This is known in some such quarters as examining your conscience, and how we can improve either or both of those two categories." And the syntax and what he's doing and what he's proposing sticks in my head. And if anyone wants copies of the Mimeos, I'll do the archivist thing. Send you his vocab for Lord Jim, if you'd like. I still have it. 11 years ago, when David turned 75, Gabrielle and Raph invited friends and family to write something or share something. And you did. I don't know how that all worked out, but I can only imagine. It must have been beautiful. But I wrote something and sent it to Gabriella. And I found it, and I want to read to you a paragraph, the opening paragraph, because I think it sums up everything I feel about David. So this was written to him, it's sort of written to him in his voice. And it reads, "Where to begin? I'll start with carrot pasta and bay scallops. I think your original recipe called for finely diced red pepper, though I can't recall if this was part of the original equation, or if I slipped in that color and flavor on my own. I suspect you thought to include the red pepper as your taste and feel for these things is impeccable. The sweet and the salt, the textures, and the presentation of the dish. Then you give me shit for so-called French preoccupation with these kinds of details. So much to consider around a meal. For a person in his early 20s who knew none of this, really, but who had a feel for food, this was immensely important. To sit at a table with all the familiar sensations. The air, the wood stove, the bric-a-brac of a New England kitchen, the glass bottles and crocks, and cutting boards, a devotion to the history of a place, the smell of night and water on the ground. Imagine a 23-year-old who is not getting laid but is surrounded by adolescents. They're coming undone by their sense of sex and emerging obligations, and he's a year out of college, trying to compose himself and take some sort of calculated step into the so-called world of work. I tell you, it was comforting to be cut loose in a classroom, to find my way, to be welcomed at your table, be given a drink, introduced to food and conversation, and included in family rituals. So here we are, another family ritual, right? And it means the world to me to be able to be here with you all. And I just always think of it in my head and my heart. Thanks.
Chris, you want to come up? That'd be great. Thank you.
So to speak, the audience, of course, when Dave leaves, the world turns to ice. My name's Chris Eigenman. I was a student at Putney starting in '79. And when I first got there, David was this terrifying bull of a man, a purposeful leading from the shoulders walk that invited no one to join in. I was 14, and I figured maybe best just to keep my distance. Within the first year, he was directing plays and teaching English, and I was lucky enough to be doing both with him. Now, a little history. In the 4 years I was there, a lot of us were there together. We did plays by Brendan Behan, Jean-Paul Sartre, Chekhov, Pirandello, Harold Pinter, Beckett, Albee, and some others. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any other high school in North America in the early 80s that were doing that collection of plays. And that isn't to say that there wasn't some pushback. There was, sometimes from the school, sometimes from parents. Sometimes you'd hear a collective cry of, "Oh God, why can't you do The Princess and the Pea?" Or My Kingdom for an Odd Couple. Why can't you do normal plays? But, and I really want to say this carefully, in the best way, David didn't give a rat's ass about an audience. He cared deeply for those playwrights and for the people who were putting on the plays. And if the audience wanted to come along, great. If not, there wasn't much he could do about it. And for 4 years, it was thrilling. It was part being a pirate and part being an artistic Jesuit, and David was absolutely our leader. My guess is that David taught many of us here the same things. The value of a well-written line, the value of a well-directed scene, the value of a well-reasoned argument, the value of a well-cooked meal, the value of a good bottle of whiskey. A quick story. So when you're a senior at Putney, maybe still, you had to do what was called a senior project, which was supposed to be something outside what you normally did at school. And at the time, we were rehearsing a Pinter play that was supposed to go up in a few weeks, and it really wasn't going very well. And since the cast were all seniors, we suggested to David that we just rehearse during the project. David said, great. School said, no, absolutely not. So David came back and said, yeah, we're doing it. But if anyone asks, say we're doing an exploration of Italian literature. Nobody asked and we forgot about it. The play got better and we all graduated. Over the summer, my mom called, ecstatic, with my last report card. In particular, my Italian lit project. And I honestly had no idea what she was talking about. But then she started reading, and I realized that David had to write up a report card of our fictive project. Now, when you went to Putney, you didn't really get report cards, you got little stories. Here's the Italian story that I said. Chris, I can't tell you how pleased I am with the work you did in this project. I thought just getting through the theater trilogy by Pirandello would be formidable because of its long disquisitions on the illusion of reality and the reality of illusion. But that you still found time to read 2 modern tragedies by Ugo Betti and Mirabilina by Goldoni showed the seriousness of your intent. And finally, to extend your study of illusion reality theme by reading Pirandello's Enrico IV was more than I had a right to expect, even from a dedicated theater person. It was a great project. Sorry we can't do it again sometime, David. In the years that followed, David became both a good friend and a touchstone. I would send him what I was writing, he would send thoughts back, and sometimes I'd make the pilgrimage up to Nancy and David's kitchen table and hash out plot points, argue structure, and hope to hell he'd make dinner. When one of the scripts that came out of that kitchen was actually about to become a film, I asked David to come to New York and play the cop who ends up shooting the leading lady. He was fantastic. Standing in a parking lot at 4 a.m., shooting off a 38 with full blank loads, it was clearly the most fun you could ever have in a parking lot at 4 a.m. And when the film premiered a year later, I was honored that he came down to New York City. As I was introducing the film, I also introduced the actors who were there. And in true Calicchio fashion, with everybody in there finally, as I called out his name, he flipped me off. I will miss him every day.
There's someone
Mohsen, I'm from Iran.
Hey, Lori, it's not on.
Yeah, my name is Mohsen Maghloubi. They call me Mo. And I came to town of Putney back in 1978 to Windham College. And David was my teacher. And after a few weeks, school closed. And I had no place to go, no money in my pocket. And I was basically helpless. No one to turn to. I didn't know anybody. Literally zero. And so I was supposed to leave the school and go someplace. I didn't know where to go. Didn't have, as I said, no money, no address, I didn't have anybody to call. And so I was waiting at the lobby to just know they kick me out somehow, like state police or somebody come to get me out of there. And I noticed a man, somebody walking toward me. I didn't know who. I mean, I didn't look at him. I just noticed somebody approaching me. I saw his feet, and I looked up and I saw David, this big guy, and he's my take, He said, "You." He didn't say anything to me. He said, "You." And I jumped, happy, and so I followed him to his home and introduced me to Nancy and Gabriel and is the other's name? I haven't met. He's in California, so I don't meet him very often. Anyway, so today I'm in Putney for 40 years because of David. If it wasn't there, I don't know what would have happened to me. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm here today because of David. Thank you, David. I love you.
Hi, everyone. So I was asked to keep this short, but as David might say when I go on at the dinner table, he'd say, "Don't worry, we have all night." And here you are. So a few personal reflections in vignettes. So there'll be a lot of talk here today, and there has been already, about eating and drinking, of appetites of all sorts. David saw intellectual hunger and curiosity reflected in an appetite brought to the table. He engaged his guests, tested their endurance over multiple courses, stages of conversation. He reveled in a general good mood, rising to euphoria like lit wrappers of amaretti cookies wafting to the ceiling. At the dining table, maybe like in the boxing ring, there were no shortcuts. To be sure, there was a degree of machismo in this. Unique as he was, David was also of his era. Sure, you can call him a Hemingway type. But we're talking about a Depression-era kid born on Hanover Street in Boston who learned to box and who learned to cook from his mother. David and Nancy regularly made the trip to Boston's North End to shop, just as his mother had. I joined David and Nancy on one of these outings. First lesson, don't buy everything from the same market. Cheese from here, sausage from over there, and the rabbit from around the corner. Show them you're discerning, spread it around, or else there's no respect from the butcher or the shopkeeper. If you spotted David and Nancy in his old neighborhood, just a local couple out shopping, he'd have no time for pleasantries. He had an agenda. Cheese, veal, sausage. I came to Putney in the fall of 1989 as an intern, never having painted nor having taught. The painting thing, I thought I could figure out. How hard could it be? The teaching, that was daunting. Thank God there was a plan. Learning by doing. It was Putney, after all. Calicchio ran the intern program. His curriculum, a forum of weekly dinners at his home. At the first of these dinners, a troupe of young, earnest, not yet teachers in biology, history, English, Latin, and I, the new art intern, paraded into the big white house, a former parsonage perched on a hill, surrounded by gardens, apple trees, and stone walls in Westminster West. Nancy greeted everyone at the door, and we filed into the kitchen. David stood between the sink and the stove, hands on the counter like a boxer in his corner, ready to spar. What'll you have, he asked. White wine, please. English intern. Same, history intern. Nothing, thanks. Okay, maybe some sparkling water. Latin intern. Do you have a light beer? Biology. And then it's my turn. What'll you have? He tossed his question out again. What do you got? David's eyes drew narrow and smiled, in the way I think we can all picture. Ha, all right. David pulled out a bottle of the good stuff, a 21-year Macallan from the lower corner cupboard. And I remember because I was just 22. The good stuff came as gifts. Actually, they were more like offerings from former students, grateful parents of former students who he championed, even those who barely graduated. From good friends, the Wenders, John Irving, and countless others at New Year's Eve. His birthday party, that was never his birthday party. And David never bought the good stuff himself. He didn't ask for the intern program. He didn't want additional obligations. As you all know, when it came to Putney, the only thing David really cared about was the actual teaching. And he figured out a way to get the most out of it, for himself and for us. That Putney reimbursed him for the meal, the wine, and the good time was a victory. Giving it to the man, after all, was a major Calicchio goal. He centered his program around what he loved, food and conversation. These weekly intern dinners became a laboratory for talking about the things that mattered most. And that happened most successfully when the guest speaker went off script, when it got real and personal, when the bullshit of an organized program disappeared and gave way to passion, as it's likely to do after the third bottle of wine. This was a halcyon period. David and Nancy's version of a Harkness table in Westminster West. Discussion about literature, art, language, theater, opera, critique, pedagogy, even earth sciences. Really, this was an extension of graduate school for me. Close to 30 years of matriculation in the Calicchio method. By the end of that intern year, spring of 1990, I hung a few paintings, many still wet, in the faculty room, including one of a local high school baseball game. The bare hills are the pink of spring, the playing field still a burnt orange from winter. On the mound is a southpaw and a windup. The runner has a long lead from third. It's a picture of suspended adolescence. Everything's about to happen. You call yourself a fucking painter? Classic Calicchio. A corkscrew punch. The amount of time it takes David to cross the room is exactly the right amount of time to unnerve and rock my foundation. Because I wanted to be just that, pass. I didn't punch back. Maybe it was just that I was prepared to meet him there, toe to toe. How much, he says. It was validation at precisely the right moment. I guess I passed. 300, I said. 100 in dinner. 102 dinners. Sold. Those 2 dinners were exceeded. And there were other subsequent bouts and agreements made for paintings and meals. And those terms, too, were exceeded with pasta and sometimes even rabbit from the North End. And, of course, the good stuff. But the deal-making was all showboating. It was the actual exchange we enjoyed, like for like, his art for mine. We joked about losing track of all the accounting. It didn't matter. Now, I am a fucking painter. And all I can say is that without David and Nancy, I couldn't do what I do today. I was blown away by my inclusion in their world, and that these people recognized something in me. They became my intellectual parents. And what do parents do? They feed you. The diet is caloric and cerebral. I'm sure others here today can speak to you better about David as a teacher. I know he opened doors and changed lives with cryptic remarks scrawled across papers. What is this bullshit? A jab intended to keep a student honest. A pushback that said, I'm paying attention. What were you smoking when you wrote this? Followed by the directive, everyone should be so lucky to hear. Write to enlighten, not to impress. He noticed, sought out, and thoroughly enjoyed the untapped potential and unpredictability of his students. There is one thing he said to me that stands out especially. Once, after enduring colleague after colleague going on about prized students and their recent successes, Calicchio bellows, "For Christ's sakes, give the kid half a brain, they think he's a genius." And then he leans over to me and whispers, "Anyone can teach a National Merit Scholar. Try reaching the struggling kid." And this really stuck with me. David, the Red Sox fan, was drawn to the underdog in any field. The kid who's almost there and could surprise you. Hearing his side remarks reinforced my instinct, and I think made me a better teacher. That's Calicchio the teacher, but there was also Calicchio the writer. I remember being surprised when I first learned that he maintained a regular and rigorous schedule of writing. He was dedicated to this craft throughout his life. He wrote short stories and plays and translated works by Pirandello. I asked him once how he'd describe himself. "I'm a fucking reader." This reply didn't invite any further discussion. And I've never heard anyone else, even those for whom reading and literature is their life, describe themselves in this way. And I've tried to make sense of it. And what I keep coming back to is his classical education at the famed Boston Latin School, the oldest public school in the country, where he had completed 6 years of Latin and Greek and had already read many of the classics before going to Harvard. Content and meaning, memorization, reading, reading, reading. This meant he could recite, quote, and recall passages at critical moments in conversation or in the classroom. To me, it seemed he was admitting his compulsiveness. David was clearly proud of this education. In fact, when Putney's Dean of Faculty tried to mandate that all faculty members attain a master's degree, Calicchio put down his crossword, stood up, walked to the door, stopped in the center of the room, in the middle of faculty meeting, faced the dean, and raised his middle finger. Fuck you. I have an AB from Harvard College, attained in 1954. Tell me if you need to know what AB stands for. And out he walked. That was Calicchio. As Char Nord told me recently, David was a freelance intellect. Hey, did you see the Renoirs in Boston? Good stuff, huh? To be honest, I've never appreciated Renoir. I've always thought of him as sappy, sentimental. David, I said, you wouldn't tolerate that sort of limpid, weak structure in any work of writing. Why in these paintings? Oh, come on, those nudes? Not bad. David loved the voluptuousness. He couldn't stop talking about them. Here's David. He was coarse, but he was also a sensualist who appreciated the beauty of the female form and the demonstration of its beauty in the works of Rubens, Titian, Gauguin, and to my surprise, Renoir. Then I realized maybe I shouldn't be so quick to write Renoir off. After all, Matisse loved Renoir too, and probably for the same reasons Calicchio did. Color, volume, sensuousness. And maybe, even for some of the same reasons I loved David. His mind was wide-ranging. He responded to passion and honesty. He liked what he liked. So, I'd like to leave you with just one last image. In Calicchio's kitchen, you can hear favorite operas playing in the afternoon while the pasta's being made. Sunlight filters through, flour hanging in the air. David's cooking. If he's the headlining tenor, Nancy's the choreographer and director. The table's set with her family's china and silver. It's elegant, never ostentatious. She arranges the seating. She helps guide the conversation. She plates her understated salad of fresh greens from her garden, a necessary counterbalance to the richness of the main course. David and Nancy worked together to create an atmosphere important to them, where ideas and appetites could intermingle freely and unrestrained. It may have been David's pasta, but it was their table. And like Mrs. Ramsay's table in To the Lighthouse, the Calicchio dinner, its homemade pasta, meatballs, stuffed zucchini, enjoyed with wine and conversation reflected in the alchemy of the evening, were of a piece and became a work of art. And though not lastingly physical, they are permanent in memory. The thing is made that remains forever after. This would remain. Not bad, David. Not bad.
I was just informed that there are lots of people out in the hallway. I don't know if there's any way to sort of move some people in. There's some space behind these borders here. I don't know. I don't know how many people are out there now, but I just was told that there were people there who couldn't hear.
More people in here with benches.
Are there still people out there who would like to walk in? Have them come in, please. We can we can fill up the other side. Yeah, that's true. We can go up the side stairs. So please just come right in.
Put another bench here, straighten it out. Yeah. But then there's room for other people.
Well, I'm David. I'm David Calicchio's nephew. Let me tell you, he would be really pissed off if the Patriots were playing today. He would not stand this. And if anybody wants to come in, there are some seats in the front. I'm going to come down. Yeah, they grow them tall in Queens. There's no shoulder on them. So if you knew my Uncle David, then you knew you could tell quite a lot just from a simple glance, or a glare for that matter. And his laughter and his chuckles, they could speak volumes. You know, he had his own language, and for me it was quite easy to understand. I was around him since I was a kid. You know, there was a time when I was a teenager, I was going through some things, and he gave me one of those glares and a chuckle. And I got them both, actually. So, the glare and the chuckle. And basically the translation was, what the F are you doing with your effing life? And that was kind of all I needed. From that point, I straightened out. I always wanted to make him proud. And I knew he cared about me, and I never wanted to let him down. And that's the way I felt about him. I remember a few years later, he came to see me play baseball in college. And I was just so proud to have him there, and you know, my father watching me play. I never felt anything like that, and you know, nothing ever felt better to see him there on the sidelines rooting me on. That was my uncle. So, excuse me. It's funny, you know, some people can vouch for this. You know, we never actually greeted each other with an embrace. When I was a kid, he'd come right up to me. He'd try to hand me a set of keys or a glass. whatever he had in his hand, and he'd say, "Here, hold this." You know, and I would fall for it every time, and he'd send a left hook or a right across my way, and I just... I was so young and naive back then, and 14 years later or so, here I am, 27 years old at the time. Finally, I wised up. I would get him this time. So on a visit to New York, I thought that I would turn the tables on him. When he was distracted, I attempted to hand him a set of keys. He faked the handoff, he dropped the left hook towards my abdomen, and we basically called it a draw at that point. But every time we met thereafter, we would square off like Rocky Marciano and Jersey Joe Walcott, and we'd shadow box and we'd throw punches, and that was just our thing. And that's how we said hello, and that's how we say, I miss you, and I'm just glad to see you. So he was a Red Sox Patriots fan, I'm a Yankees Giant fan, and you put two grown men in front of the TV with this kind of rivalry, and you're gonna watch two grown men turn into children. We watched a number of games together, down in New York, up here in Vermont, and those times with him are just some of the best memories. And I watched games with my father, and when he left in 2003, I was just thankful to still have my uncle. So I hope I can be that to somebody one day. The last few times we met, we embraced. It's not something I thought about. I don't think he did either, it just happened. But I'm glad we did. And I'm glad we had a chance to say goodbye. But then we squared off and we threw a couple of punches and so one last memory, it was Thanksgiving 2004 in Vermont. The Red Sox had just won the World Series, broke the curse of the Bambino, and 1918 was finally a memory. The house was just full of the aroma of Thanksgiving, and we had all just finished a hike up the mountain. Gabriella, Rafaela, we all just, went up that mountain, came back, and we were starved, heading to the dinner table. So here comes Uncle David with a garment in his hand, and he looks right at me, and he says, "What do you think you're doing?" So, and this is not a Magic Mike moment. 2004 World Series champions. So, hands me the garment. I said, "Well, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to have some Thanksgiving dinner, Uncle." He says, "You're not sitting anywhere until you put this on." So this is the first time I've worn it since. And I promised myself when I dug it up out of my bottom drawer over the weekend, I promised myself that I would put it on every Thanksgiving from this point on. So the last couple of years, if you guys know David, you would always ask him how he was doing. Anybody remember the response? I'm still here.
Yes.
All right. Well, you're still here, Uncle David.
Yes.
You'll always be right here.
Would someone else like to come up and speak? Great.
Hello, I'm Tim Campman, sort of a neighbor of David, but I somehow Putney gave him to me both as a sophomore and a senior, 82 and 84, and so I must have needed extra work. And I'm so jealous of all of the lucid recollections that everybody is talking about this amazing person, because I really have almost no recollection at all of anything during high school. However, I do have to say that somehow, some miracle during that time uncovered itself that allowed me to drop into books in a way that was, that I had no idea how that happened or why that happened. But I know, because of the books, who actually taught me that. And it was David, who somehow allowed me to drop into Dostoevsky in a way that I just sort of didn't understand. And this whole idea of onions being dropped down to hell to haul somebody out was given to me by him. And for that, I am so eternally thankful that I was plunged into that world that I didn't really even know about, and that he allowed me to enter. And of course, I saw him because I live here, and I saw him over the years, and that's been very, very wonderful, and I never forgot what a bad speller I was, but this sort of veiled presence that allowed for the entrance into a secret world, for which I will always thank him, and he will always be with me.
There's another quote I think we have to share here. Dave retired from the Putney School the year I left, and people would say to him, "What are you going to do?" And his reply was always, "Whatever I want." So I think of that when I think of Dave's famous quotes. Vincent, are you, there you are, come right up. Thanks. Up. There is a set of stairs right here.
Yep, there.
Well, everybody can hear, I hope. I have to read this or else I'll descend into incoherence. When I was a kid, I read a Western called Duel in the Sun. You may remember the movie with Gregory Peck, the bad guy in love with the bad girl, Jennifer Jones. In the book, there's a scene at Peck's funeral officiated by the character called the Reverend Sin Killer. Sin Killer begins his eulogy with the words, "Lord, what can we say to goose this man through the pearly gates?" David would have liked the line. He would have said, "Not bad," which really meant really good. Pearly gates aside, the question is how to express the love and affection we all have for David. God, I'm really getting emotional. I think this would happen. Who brought us here, who brought us together with Nancy so many times at his home and table. David was an outlaw in his own way. Even before Nancy asked me to speak about David as a friend and fellow writer, I knew that I would stand and say a few words to try to celebrate his full life in light of our friendship, to express what he meant to me, and I hope to you. Over our co-op lunches and orders of sushi at the Pan Asian, of course, the many plates of what he called pasta, and I called macaroni just to tease him. Beneath this crusty exterior, David was a tender and vulnerable guy who needed us as we needed him. David loved wordplay and books and art, and he appreciated all those who made them. He knew more about literature than anyone I'll ever know. His own creations, those novels and stories and plays, and even the teaching, he sometimes disavowed, but whose disavowals I never believed. All this was his life work and what we will miss. I didn't know David as long as many of you here. I met him when both of us were starting to get gray hairs. Over the years, we enjoyed each other over food and literature, and surely the first bond of our friendship played into our mutual ethnicity. David had a natural inclination to box, to banter. And I knew such types from my own family, so I could box with him, play defense, give him room, knowing that we respected each other.
I was from New York, and he was from Boston, and so I represented a friendly enemy. I'd been a Brooklyn Dodger fan, and therefore I had it out for the Yankees just as much as he did. Geography and being Italian was one basis for our friendship. The other was the writing. I told David I was a writer right away, but he didn't tell me he was one. Not at first, anyway. It was a secret he wouldn't reveal until a few years later, a few years after I knew him, even though other people had already told me that David was a writer. So I waited for him to come around. Even then, he never revealed the full extent of what he'd written. I knew nothing until much later about his experience with theater or how many plays and stories and novels he'd written. When he did come around, we started exchanging our work. David was a no-bullshit critic. He didn't mince words, and he cared about getting it right. He had a good eye for character and story. He showed me where I needed to foreshadow, where I wrote too much, where I didn't write enough. And he knew when I hadn't gotten to the bottom of something I'd set out to write. He took my suggestions for his own work, but whether he acted on them, I never knew. Much of what he showed me over the years was earlier work, a portrait of a Boston literary kid who tried to square what he found in books with what he found in the real world. It's funny now, I'm trying to get to the bottom, to commemorate David for what he was in as many dimensions as I knew him, as friend and writer, as extensive reader and lover of art and artists, who also imparted his sensibility to me, and so, when I write, I don't think this is that. Anyway, when I write, I keep in mind and even hear his rasping Don Corleone voice. I came into his life during his last years at the Putney School. I've heard of his reputation as a teacher who got to the center of things, and one day when he told me he was teaching Heart of Darkness, I asked if I could sit in on his class. I did, and I remember that a student asked David to comment on some obscure passage. And David said, "This is just some Conradian bullshit." It's easy to see that many of his students were inspired by his honesty and insight. That was his gift to them and to us. We come now to David, the Renaissance man, the lover of art and food, the punster whose way of giving was to feed people, and what better way is there? Where he got his energy for those squid pizzas and fresh pasta and stuffed zucchini and pastici, I don't know. For David, no gringo food, as he called it. Even when he slowed down, the food prep came easily. Many of us were lucky enough to have been at David's with the wood stove breathing like a straw, and Puccini in the background, and David singing in Italian while he drained the pasta and carefully ladled on the bubbling sauce. How he tossed it with 2 dinner forks, surely as his mother had done. And how he gracefully accepted the "David, you outdid yourself" compliments with his little teddy bear growl. And how, at the end of the meal, he would roll up the amaretti biscuit wrapper and light it. Good luck when the ash flies upward, which it always did. That was David. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jerry Lipschultz, and I feel like I'm David's 3rd daughter. So it was 1977, 40 years ago. I was a graduate of the esteemed Iowa Writers Workshop. But I had stayed on a year to get more courses in because I also had nowhere else to go. I came east, ended up in Hanover, New Hampshire, and my teacher, John Irving, gave me the name of his best friend, who was hiring reading teachers. So those were the days when David had a reading company. And I had never taught. I had studied, but I had never taught. I had an elementary education degree. My mother was a teacher. I didn't want to be a teacher, but I needed a job. So as I'm hearing all this, I feel like I was one of David's lost causes. The vulnerable person that he somehow saw, and he was teaching at Wyndham College, and I remember having these phone conversations with him and thinking, do I really want to be a teacher? Who's this guy? But John had said he's his best friend, so I thought, okay, John was my teacher, I should trust. So I go to Wyndham College. He told me to meet him there, that he'd be sitting in front of the door of one of the buildings with a book in his hand. There he was, sitting there with a book in his hand, and I'm walking from the parking lot and looking at him, and I'm thinking that he was kind of scary. And I didn't know how to teach, but I thought, well, I'm a graduate of the famous Iowa Writing Workshop, so I'm okay. So I was frightened. I was creating my best self. It was a bit of a patina. And it didn't take long for David to see through me, but he didn't give up on me. He would give me a job and an education. He would teach me how to teach. It's a performance art, he'd say. Never forget that. You have to defend yourself. So funny. Defend yourself. I got it, though. I watched him teach. He was amazing. He listened. He mesmerized everyone. He was an entertainer with an edge, and with the world of literature at his disposal. That's what I saw. I was an awful teacher. I was doing everything he told me to do. Write this on the board, write that on the board, but I didn't have his sense of humor. And he'd look at me, and I knew he took pity on me. And as people say, he didn't give up on me. And so I had a beat-up car, a loyal dog, a wooden box full of my favorite books, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake and Nabokov were among them. Calicchio didn't care much for Joyce or Nabokov. One day I said to him, well, that's because they're writers, Calicchio. He said, what do you mean by that, Lipschultz? What's a writer's writer? I would live to eat those words. So this was for 2 years, and when I wasn't in the car or holing up in one of my New York City friends' flats, I was living at the Calicchio residence. I was living with Nancy and Gabriella and Rafaela, and they were teenagers, and they were adorable and beautiful and teenagers. And
Yeah, I don't think so.
younger,
Nice try.
like 11, 12, right?
Well, those are teenagers. Those are teenagers.
Oh, I saw you as teenagers. I was 26. So, like David was about the age of my father's brother. So I looked at him as my father, and he was like my literary father. And I remember when he was teaching me, and we were both, and he had a cold. Do you remember? He had a cold in his eyes or something. We're sitting at the kitchen table, and I'm trying to listen to him, and I'm like bored out of my skull. You know, how to teach reading and study skills and speed reading. But he had this magical way of teaching it, and all these kids would be interested when he taught, but not when I taught. Anyway. The generosity of this family is such that they never asked me for rent, never money for food, but gave me a feeling of comfort I've had nowhere else except in my own home. They would welcome my husband, my 2 children, each of the 6 dogs that came and went in the 40 years that had so quickly passed me by. He would read almost every word that I ever wrote. He would reread books as I revised, and he would tell me what he thought. And eventually he would send me his own work that I would read and wonder why the hell why we're not reading his work. I was the recipient of 30 years of letters that would become faxes and then emails, and his letters were a work of art. Would you like to hear a little bit of one of these letters? I'm gonna go for this one. I went back for a PhD when I was in my 50s, and I had to teach proof rock. So I asked him, how do you teach proof rock? He said, rarely taught proof rock because I rarely taught juniors, and American Lit was reserved for them. When I did teach, though, I taught in conjunction with his short poems. The preludes, sweet, bitter, imagistic things that set up some of proof rock's themes. And I tended to let the kids find their own ways into the poem. Only intruding mine when they came to dead ends or were missing when I thought there were key things. He goes on, I will have to keep owing you the mesmerizing story because I cannot recall what it was I had gained a reputation for as an effective storyteller. So I was asked by the boss to prepare something special for the midsummer campfire, something to do with the history of our location, though we were near the ocean. The camp was a small lake that was previously thought to have been owned by an Indian tribe. I had heard Wagner's Lohengrin, I'm mispronouncing it, Lohengrin? In the spring, and was struck by his entrance on a boat pulled by swans. Walter Slezak's father, a Wagnerian tenor at the Met, missed his cue one night and is rumored to have said to the stagehands, "What time is the next swan?" And two of my favorite pieces of music at the time were often Bach's Barcarolle and Debussy's Clair de Lune. So as darkness fell close to 9 o'clock in that midsummer, I talked about fireflies swarming at the far end of the lake and how they suddenly began to approach, and as they did so, form themselves into a boat, a canoe, and paddling it was the Indian chief whose land we had taken for our camp, and he wanted it back or some such thing. I was improvising, of course, but the kids loved it. Then they were too frightened to go to sleep. I may have said something silly, like, he patrols the lake night sighting. We have the occasional lunar owl singing at night for his losses, but can only be seen when the moon is full because that, our campfire was on or near a full moon, was when the pilgrims killed him and sold his lake to other people. Anyway, I want to read you one other thing that he wrote. When I asked him to help me with something, and he said, "Lipschultz, you said to be frank, and I will try. What you've written is a nightmare." Not because it's terrifying, but because it's ultimately impenetrable, like nightmares, where quick shifts in time and place are normal, and logic, as we know it, doesn't apply for things that have no right to happen, and only a non-discursive dream logic exists. Then he says, cut out 10% of the detail. It gives good focus, but there's too much of it. And kill the pompous knowing tone out of the dialogue. I mean, what kind of person would talk the way he does? And then he says, Lipschultz, stop writing novels and start working on oxymorons. Quote, because I was always and still looking for a full-time job. The freedom of a full-time job is perhaps the best I've ever heard. And being both Italian and anarchist by blood, I've heard a lot of them.
I met David through Nancy. I remember when Dottie brought Nancy up the steps the first day she came to the grammar school. I came here in the mid-60s, terrified with long hair. I was so frightened, I think I scared a lot of people, but not David. We lived next door, and he invited me to babysit his two beautiful children. I never knew that he was an English teacher. My father is an English teacher, and it felt very familiar when I came to his house, but I always had a strange feeling of closeness with him. And later, when I pretended to be a boxer in Boston for a little while, I talked to him about boxing, and I finally got it through my thick head after too many blows to the head that David didn't think it was maybe a very good idea for me to be a boxer, and I listened to him. And I'm sure he's made impressions on all of your lives, but getting me out of the fighting game with my short arms was a huge step forward. I spent one afternoon in David's garden. It was like something out of The Godfather. He needed a tree cut, and I cut it up for him and started splitting it up, and he said, our other guy told us that wood won't burn, and I said, well, if it doesn't, please let me know. I have someone I'd like to sell it to. And I made him laugh, and I was always very proud of that, because he'd always been so entertaining and accepting. I had some sheep that he'd help me rescue occasionally, and they would somehow manage to get themselves strangled, and I would run next door, and I wasn't strong enough to lift them up, and he would come over and just move them effortlessly. I just feel really privileged to have known him and been accepted by him, and I don't know really how to end this, but
Okay, I'm David's nephew, and I'm really right. I'm kind of hanging up right now, but I just crawled up half a mile hill. Had that ran 2 Achilles tendon repairs in 2 weeks, but yeah, I got up there on like 2 leg and 1 hand crab up the stairs. But here I am. Sorry, yes, here I am. But anyway, but yeah, I think my Uncle David, maybe I realized it too late. I mean, he just, at some point, he just wanted to have like an uncle relationship with me, you know. Like, I was always full of a lot of intellectual bullshit, as he would say. And, you know, I used to like, you know, talk to other people. I mean, coming up to Putney when I was a kid, I was really impressed that there are other ways to live, unconventional, you could be a free thinker. It influenced me a little, but I figured things out on my own. But it definitely did. I'd have to say my uncle influenced me a lot more than I would actually admit. But I'm admitting it now. But he's definitely a guy who had his heart and his mind in good balance. And so I was gonna have anesthesia, so my wife wouldn't tell me, so I found out 2 days later. But yeah, a few days later, I'm recovering on the couch, and I did a poem, and it usually didn't really need a lot of editing. Some people in this room would probably beg to differ, seeing so many writers go through. My Uncle David always said, writing is the hardest thing you can ever do, so I tapped out for a while, and became a musician and a songwriter. And when I couldn't do that, I went back to it about a year or 2 ago. Found out I had matured and, maybe I've lived a little bit. So I went back, and the New England thing has always resonated with me. I was, my father being a New Englander, of course, Francis Virgil Calicchio. And so I'll just read the poem, yes, and that's what I'm going to do. So this is David Calicchio walking off into the maples. And I'll try to break down. I'll do it, okay. Okay. There was always something enigmatic about the stand of maples far behind David and Nancy's house in Putney, Vermont. I have a murky, loosely rendered painting of it, yet never actually ventured there physically, so it remains a place beyond my reckoning, only empirically tested by sight and taste, as the trees were mysteriously tapped for the best maple syrup I have ever had. I had decided not to investigate further and was satisfied to let it remain that way. We get old, we assess our isms, become something more and less absolute. Losing count of wood-fire winters, take comfort in the usual and familiar, yet feel we have not relished each season enough. And take a break. As it was with each visit to Putney, the figure of David Calicchio walking away became more delineated, more defined, as if it contained his increasingly formless corporeality filled with good food and scotch. His broad back in a faded yellow guayabera shirt, baggy trousers from Filing's basement, duck-footed gait, still powerful and prideful as a boxer's, close-cropped and bearded like a Trotskyite, all the nebulous intellectualism we bested each other with had all led to a place where it needed to be negated and become something to be fond of and as present as the surrounding hills. Uncle, husband, father, patriarch. I realized it too late when I came to know him. He was more interested in the score of the Red Sox game than dialectics. I wailed for him as you wail for a father, for his great life had formed me. So I see him walking off into the maples, still my Aunt Nancy's hazy depiction. Then they open up, no longer the two dimensions of the medium. There's dappled yellow light, embers and cypselae dance in the air. Francis and Swinter, they're already tending a fire. You guys smile slyly, swagger a bit. Cigarette packs rolled in your t-shirt sleeves, black hair pomaded. You join in. Then it's Fenway Park on opening day, chewing fresh poured tar on Hanover Street. It's the 4th of July, 1976, and John is coming over. We drive to Brattleboro for supplies in your Beetle. It's every dog you ever lost come back. And the end of every revolution, a movement. And there's love, great love. Okay.
Is there anyone else who has something? Yes, Eric, please.
For those of you that don't know me, I'm Eric Evans. I taught with David for 12 years at the Putney School. In fact, I began teaching there, and I would not have survived 2 weeks there without his support. It was uncanny. He was a great friend, a great mentor. Later, I worked with Nancy and enjoyed the same kind of mentorship. And I just wanted to thank them both for that. I'll give you 3 little stories about David on a little bit of the lighter side. He's the most well-read man I've ever met or heard of. I've always wanted to be there if he and Harold Bloom ever got into a conversation. We were having a group meeting with the day student parents at one point, and David and I were there, and they got to discussing something about the curriculum of what the 9th graders were reading. And this mother was going on. She was complaining about what they were reading. She said, well, have you read the latest literature on this? And David's antenna, like this. And he said, well, what exactly latest literature are you talking about? And I said, oh, lady, this is going to be good. She didn't say much after that. I got to know David in stages, and he always portrayed himself early on as from the other side of the tracks. The poor boy, the boxer, fighting his way up, and then I had him a little bit speechless one time. When I finally figured it out, I said, David, wait a second. Dr. Sun, Boston Latin, and Harvard. And you're from the other side of the tracks. Well, a few years later, he reciprocated a little bit. We were at a faculty meeting, and I see Mike Maricki is here, and I think he might have been there at that faculty meeting.
Putney School faculty meetings in those days, I don't know what they're like now, but they tended to be rather a mixture of catharsis and venting and a little bit of pedagogy. Maybe that's true of most faculty meetings. But we had an outside somebody, a consultant, come in who was going to straighten us out and straighten out the Putney School and so on. We had to sit there this whole morning with things posted on here and there and ideas and brainstorming and all these things. Calicchio and I are just beside ourselves, sitting in the back, as usual. And I said to David, I said, this is just, this is nonsense. It's a waste of time. He said, oh, Eric, I agree with you, yeah. And so at the end of the meeting, the guy started to go around the room and he wanted comments on what the meeting was like, and I think he was looking for favorable comments. So he started in and, the people was, oh, that's the most wonderful thing, he gave us great insights and so on and so forth. And I said to Dave, I said, when they get to me, I'm going to tell them, what's up. He said, absolutely, Eric, I'll be right behind you. So they got around and around and around, praise after praise. Marisa was praising him, Ed Shore, it's the most wonderful thing. On and on. And it finally got to me, I said, well, really, that's the biggest waste of time I have had in a long time. And I'm not the only one that feels that way. And I turned, he had disappeared. There he was outside the library in the window, waving at me. Thanks, David.
It's really just amazing to think about all the lives that Dave transformed over the years, and to actually have seen that happen. I really can't think of another teacher who has transformed as many lives as profoundly as David did. I arrived at Putney in 1989 and taught with Dave for many years, I think until he retired, along with Lori, Eric Evans, and that motley crew in the English office. That was always like stepping into a boxing ring. It was the same dimension. Actually, I was a relatively young poet, and even worse, had majored in religious studies. David delivered quite a few air blows over the years, and I realized after each one that he was actually knocking a little more sense into me with each one. And he always had that smile on his face, and he, knowing what he'd done. He had an eidetic memory too, so he could recite poetry to me and shame me constantly. So I started to memorize a little bit myself and to write more and more. And it was wonderful talking to someone who was a fiction writer. I didn't know it at the time because it was a secret discipline, but who knew poetry too. I'd gone to graduate school, and poets were always over here, and fiction writers were, and they rarely talked to each other, which I always thought was a shame. But David went the two, and so he was always reciting either Stevens to me, or Eliot, or Shakespeare. And then I realized after many years of teaching that he was really my Virgil in many ways. He was guiding me through a world that I needed to go through, but in a way that was subtle, funny, wise. And the whole time I was teaching with him, I realized that not only was he a colleague, but he was my teacher. I was going to school with David the whole time I was in school, and it was an invaluable experience. And I'm really honored that he had such fun with me. I'm going to conclude with this poem that I wrote for him started many years ago, and it was called "In a Dark Wood," which is, of course, it occurs in the first few lines of the Inferno. And then after Dave passed, I realized that the poem wasn't finished, and I needed to conclude it as an elegy for Dave. So we'll conclude with this today. Old friend, Although it was nearly winter and cold in Vermont, he crossed the stream not far from his house and found a bower there full of life and warmth. He watched a trout and riddle swim in a pool beneath the roots of a willow tree, then followed a trail into a forest of maple, oak, and birch. When he stopped to listen, he heard a thrush in the understory singing to its mate. A breeze blew through the canopy of the highest trees, and a red-tailed hawk circled above. Gazing down at the dark, wet ground, he spied where a moose had walked on the same thin path before veering off into the woods. He ducked beneath a spider web and continued to walk toward a peak that seemed far off and close all at once, wondering as he walked just where and when he had entered these woods. All he could think was how full of sleep he had been at that moment when he left the house. All he could feel was how fully awake he was as he gazed at the peak called Delectable, called Lighthouse, that rose up before him. He observed the pass and thought of the spider that had spun her web across the path behind him. How to ride the air with so much knowledge. How to swim beyond the sharks inside the lake of his own heart. He kissed the dirt, then took a hand that suddenly appeared from out of a cloud beyond his arm and lifted him to his feet. This was the list, a voice inquired. Read the greats, divine their secrets, love your students, see through the shit, sing solo, tell the truth, feel deeply, host the guests, change the end, contradict, chase the whale, make pasta, cook pasta, float the papers, stir the sauce, kiss on the lips, hold Judas for nothing, read John again, punch the air, connect, tell stories, guffaw and rib, kvetch, write, write again, give the finger, translate to love, live, done, he said. Now lead me up, old friend, lead me up.
I know you've been here for a while, and it's amazing to see so many people here, and for me to hear different aspects of David's life and how much he touched so many people, or this room would not be this full. So I just have to thank you all for coming and for being here. It's very special, I think, for me and Raphael and Gabriella. And I'm not sure about, we were going to raise a toast, but I'm not sure we're physically able to do that. But what I would like to do is, I'd really like to give a couple of thanks first, if I might, because the grammar school has been so welcoming. Nick, our head of school, has been so gracious offering this space to us. And I want to thank Lori for orchestrating. She handles 8th graders with great aplomb, and I know she and I just, all the remembrances from everybody, those on the program and those who came up, it's just been just very special, if not a little overwhelming. David was a big person, and he leaves that with all of us. I want to give special thanks to Rachel Cortese, who has done a remarkable job with photographs. I don't know how many of you ever got to David's little room upstairs in our house, but I was not allowed in it. And the walls are covered with old photographs, some falling off with Scotch tape gone bad over many years. But Rachel had the courage, and it's right over here on this bulletin board, to go in there and photograph it. And she did a wonderful job, and she and Gabriella put up the tribute board, and Raphaela did David's favorite music, which you heard earlier, and the slideshow which Rachel put together. And all of you. We wouldn't have a celebration without you all here, so, and people brought food and wine. It's pretty wonderful. So, I don't know, let's do a virtual, I guess,
Cheers, Dad.
cheers to David. We love you, and you'll always be in all of us. So, thank you so much for being here.